this second lecture on dyslexia, we will dive deeper into looking at how dyslexia can be identified and supported. In this lecture, I will share 2 case studies to illustrate identification and support using an RTI MTSS approach. In their article assigned for this week, Mikiak and Fletcher note that there is renewed interest in dyslexia screening, identification, and treatment. There have been lots of new dyslexia legislation across the United States. Their article reviews the research on understanding and identifying students with dyslexia in public schools. They state, "We conclude that dyslexia identification and treatment processes should be built within well-implemented, multi-tier systems of support, MTSS, that include universal screening, evidence-based Tier 1 instruction, preventive intervention, ongoing progress monitoring for high-risk students, and mechanisms to intensify interventions for students who demonstrate inadequate response to high-quality instruction, similar to those that occur with other SLDs." They propose a 3-pronged hybrid approach to identification of dyslexia. The first prong, low achievement on tests of reading. The authors suggest supplementing typical RTI MTSS progress monitoring data with diagnostic measures of reading, things like the CTOP, Woodcock-Johnson, etc. These are norm-referenced assessments of reading. The second prong, looking at progress monitoring data as well as intervention integrity data, integrity of assessment, integrity of instruction, and procedural integrity. The third prong would be contextual factors, looking at exclusionary causes to rule out other causes of low reading concerns, second language acquisition, sensory disorders, etc. As discussed in the readings, the RTI MTSS model is important in understanding disability. First, when implemented well, it ensures quality instruction for all students and provides increasingly more intensive supports for students who struggle. I'm going to show you 2 case studies from my work in schools that illustrate the importance of RTI in informing decisions about reading disability. The first thing to know is both of these students were in a school that had been implementing RTI MTSS for a number of years. There were strong Tier 1 through Tier 3 supports in place, with checks on integrity of assessment, instruction, and procedures. The first student I want to talk about is Susie. Susie was a 3rd grader at the school with low reading skills. At the start of the year, everyone went through universal screening, and from these universal screening initial benchmark data, Susie was one of the students who qualified for Tier 2 intervention. She has a family history of reading concerns. 2 older brothers who were both in special education for reading disabilities had dyslexia. She, along with a number of her classmates, were put into Tier 2. So again, those who qualified based on universal screening as having low reading skills were put into a Tier 2 intervention. In the Tier 2 intervention, which was focused on word recognition skills, phonological awareness, and phonics, and fluency, progress was monitored once a week to see how the intervention was working, if it was working to improve her reading skills. Her assessment for the progress monitoring was oral reading fluency. And as you can see from this graph, looking at the Tier 1 section of the data, her progress was very minimal, especially when compared to her peers. Her peers are marked with an X. So the gap between her peers and herself in terms of reading fluency skills was widening. Susie was then provided Tier 3 supports, so a more intensive intervention. And for the sake of brevity, I am not going to describe the supports. I more just want you to see how it works in terms of looking at data under the conditions of strong interventions. So Tier 3 supports are more intensive. She got these in addition to the Tier 1 core instruction and her Tier 2 intervention. So as you can see, under the conditions of Tier 3, Susie started to make some really nice growth. And so the Tier 3 was successful. And by March, she made really rapid growth. And by the end of the year, she had caught up to her grade level peers, and her Tier 3 intervention was faded. Susie was not diagnosed as a child with a specific learning disability or dyslexia. And the reasons for this should be pretty evident. She made rapid growth under the conditions of strong intervention, and she caught up to her peers, and her intervention was able to be faded. She was a child who initially did have concerns with reading, but under the conditions of the right intervention focused on the skills that she needed, she was able to catch up to her peers. Now let's look at a case that did include a diagnosis of dyslexia. Rick attended the same school as Sally. Like Sally, he was new to the school this school year. He too was a third grade student. Rick had a history of reading concern in his file and some very vague evidence of reading intervention in first and second grade, but no real information about what happened beyond a lot of information about problems. He was an average student in other academic areas. He had been retained in first grade. Around the second week of school, Rick began exhibiting behavioral concerns, and he had no previous history of behavior concerns, disruptive behavior, and work refusal. Beginning of the school year, he was the lowest reader in the third grade. Rick's teacher and father were very concerned. Because his universal screening scores were so low, we did additional reading assessment with him in order to understand how to support him even in the Tier 2 intervention. In some cases with RTI, MTSS, you jump actually to Tier 3 in terms of planning when children are significantly behind their other peers. And this was the case with Rick. In preparation for the problem-solving meeting, this is typically done before a Tier 3 intervention at this school. But again, because his scores were so low, we felt we needed more information in order to create a plan that would work for Rick for Tier 2. So it was sort of like jumping to Tier 3. Before that meeting, the following things were collected. We obtained permission to conduct additional assessments with Rick, interviewed Rick's father about past reading and behavioral concerns, and any intervention services, and conducted additional reading assessments. These assessments were looking at earlier skills that most third graders would have mastered. So we used DIBELS at this point and looked at earlier DIBELS scores around phonological awareness, phonics, and informal phonics inventory was also done to see what phonics skills he had, and a spelling inventory. Rick's father shared that he had attended reading tutoring services through second grade last school year, but Dad could no longer afford them, and he didn't really see any evidence that they worked. And it was a private tutoring business that he attended. The past school year, he was at a different school, and that school suspected mental retardation, which was the disability label for a cognitive disability. But Dad strongly disagreed and refused to sign papers for him to be evaluated. He had not had any behavior problems until this school year. The teacher reported that he recently stopped doing all class assignments, including class assignments in other academic areas where he was doing fine. In my student interview with Rick about his reading concerns and behavior concerns, he was very articulate about his reading concerns and said that he didn't know how to read and needed somebody to teach him to read. He was also very articulate about his behavior concerns. He said he was acting up so he could get out of reading instruction, and he would rather be in the office than in reading class. He was a very articulate child and clearly understood what he needed to be successful. So interviewing him was very revealing in terms of understanding where he was coming from. And he was clearly not a child with a cognitive disability. So now let's look at what we came up with for Rick's Tier 2 plan. And it was really an enhanced Tier 2 plan. The first part of Rick's plan resembled Susie's. Tier 2 for third graders at this school who had word recognition concerns received an explicit phonics intervention 3 to 4 times a week for 30 to 40 minutes by their classroom teacher. They were grouped based on skill level in this explicit phonics intervention, and there was a group that was similar to Rick, not quite as low. As I said, he was the lowest student, but in the same ballpark of phonics skills. In addition, all third graders in Tier 2, had a classroom-based reading fluency program called Read Naturally that they did, and this placed children at their reading level and worked on reading fluency skills. The unique parts of Rick's Tier 2 plan included a phonological awareness work piece and then also additional phonics instruction. The phonological awareness work was done with this SLP, the speech language pathologist. She worked with Rick 3 times a week, and this was set up as Rick being her helper that worked with first graders around phonological awareness. So he was set up as an assistant teacher, but really these were also skills he needed support on. The phonics instruction consisted of previewing the phonics intervention that was part of Tier 2 with Rick and working on skills that he was lacking. And this was done by a Title I literacy specialist. And she worked with Rick and a couple other students 3 times a week. We did also develop a behavior plan for Rick, but honestly, this was quickly faded because once his reading supports were put into place, his behavior plan was no longer needed and his behavior was fine. This was clearly a case of a child being frustrated and trying to escape behaviors that were difficult for him. So now let's look at Rick's progress graph. This is the 3rd grade oral reading fluency graph for Rick. As you can see in Tier 1, so baseline before we began the intervention, he was significantly different than his peers. The peers are in the red X and he is the black little dots. Tier 2 was put into place, and as you can see, he made very little progress with Tier 2 when looking at 3rd grade oral reading fluency. Because his 3rd grade reading fluency skills were so low, we also monitored his progress on 1st grade reading fluency. Here's his 1st grade reading fluency graph. The X's here are the other students in his group. As I said, there were other students, as you can see, who were at a similar initial level as Rick. He was the lowest student, but there were others in the group. There were 3 students in this group that were pretty similar at the beginning of the intervention. But as you can see, his peers made strong growth, while Rick did make some growth when you look at 1st grade reading fluency, but not significant. The team met again in December to review Rick's progress so far. The good news was that Rick was a much happier student with 0 behavior concerns, and some growth in early reading skills was clearly evident. The interventions were all being implemented as planned, and Rick's attendance and engagement were excellent. Some additional assessment information was gathered prior to the Tier 3 meeting and was shared at the meeting. 1. A review of the mastery tests within the phonics program, so a curriculum-based assessment was done. These tests are repeated until students reach a mastery level, and it took Rick on average 2.5 times as long to achieve mastery compared to his intervention peers. Second, in the log notes, a log for each intervention was kept where instructors could keep notes and verify attendance and engagement. Across all interventions, it was reported that Rick had difficulty remembering skills within a lesson. In the meeting, we also looked at Rick's progress compared to peers with similar initial skills. And again, this is 1st grade reading fluency data, which is his instructional level. The team hypothesized that Rick needed additional opportunities to practice the key skills. It was agreed that the placement and skill work were the correct match. He just needed more learning trials to achieve mastery. So the following plan was designed and put in place. We kept Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports in place. We increased his phonics group to 5 days a week, 4 days with the group, and then 1 day just with Rick to reteach areas identified from the mastery assessment. We also added a preview intervention where the instructional assistant and literacy specialists kind of tag-teamed with Rick for just 15 minutes prior to his phonics group to preview the phonics skills that were going to be taught in that lesson. We also added a home component that reinforced some of these skills. And we added a correction practice procedure to the fluency intervention that he was receiving in the classroom. We changed the time that he was working with the SLP. He had mastered the phonological skills that he was working with the first graders. And so we changed this to a group that was working on vocabulary work because he was really doing well with the phonological pieces. He didn't really need the vocabulary work, but this was really helping Rick's self-confidence and self-concept, and he loved being a teacher to the younger students, so we kept that piece in place. We planned a meeting for early March to review progress and to plan for the next steps. Here is what Rick's progress monitoring data, first grade reading fluency, his instructional level, looked like in March. Rick's Tier 3 plan, building off an already intense Tier 2 plan, did improve his reading skills. He made steady progress. When the team met in early March, the team decided to formally suspect a learning disability, dyslexia, in reading. Why did we do this if he was making nice, steady progress? Rick was significantly below grade level peers. And although he was making progress, it was slow and under the conditions of significant intervention work that was individualized and intense. At this meeting, no changes were made to his Tier 3 plan. It was working. The team discussed how to proceed with his evaluation. All of the data that was gathered across the problem-solving work with Rick was used as part of his multi-factored evaluation. Based on the requirements in Ohio, which is where Rick was in school, for areas that needed to be assessed, the following additional evaluations were done by the school psychologist, myself. To assess cognitive skills, which is required in the evaluation, only a screening measure was done, as cognitive impairments were not suspected as evidenced by Rick's achievement in other academic areas, classroom performance, and his strong verbal skills. As we talked about, we need to rule out cognitive deficits when considering SLD, but we do not need to do an IQ test, and we didn't. To assess attention and behavior, rule out behavior being the cause for low achievement, a classroom observation was collected. To screen for emotional social concerns, rule out that being the cause of low achievement, interviews with teachers and parents were used, as well as an observation during a social activity, recess. These were all brief in nature because, again, they were not areas of concern. Since dyslexia was suspected for Rick, word recognition was impaired, but language comprehension was strong. A norm reference assessment targeting word recognition was done. The CTOP and the Woodcock reading mastery tests were given. This was to make sure his skill concerns were significantly below a national population of same grade peers. They were. His scores fell more than 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. Some would argue that the norm reference testing was not needed. We clearly had information that Rick was below peers in reading from his progress monitoring data. We were following the three-pronged approach to identification: low skills on a norm reference test, progress monitoring data in response to high-quality intervention, and exclusion of other reasons for low reading skills. All the areas in red were data that were collected as part of the evaluation. The items in black were data we already had as part of the intervention process. To screen for achievement concerns across academic areas, a curriculum-based measurement basic skills assessment was done. This also provided support for at least average cognitive skills. Rick was above his peers in math. The black bar is Rick and the stripes are his peers. Writing, he was also above his peers in writing when you looked at the number of words, not spelling. And listening comprehension, he was above his peers. But he was below peers in spelling and reading. Clearly, word recognition skills were the concern. After reviewing all of the evaluation data, the team did determine Rick to have a specific learning disability in reading, dyslexia. He was a fairly clear example of a child with dyslexia. Sometimes I hear the concerned voice that RTI MTSS delays services for students. In a well-functioning RTI system like the one I described for Rick and Susie, quite the opposite is true. Services for both students were implemented within the first weeks of school. Eligibility decisions move much faster in an RTI system than a traditional system, as you are carefully collecting data that is used in the evaluation throughout the tiers, and the correct children get into special education with already crafted strong intervention plans, IEPs. Rick's IEP mirrored his successful Tier 3 plan. This is an example of a seamless system between general and special education. Now that he had an IEP, the special education teacher did provide some of the services that were being provided by the classroom teacher and specialist, but Rick continued to be served in the classroom setting in a very similar manner as before. His progress continued to be monitored across the year, and he continued to make steady growth. When implemented well, an RTI MTSS system is a highly effective way to improve reading achievement of all students and also to find and support students with reading disabilities.